How to monitor SpringBatch application. In this video, we are going to use Prometheus and Grafana in order to monitor our SpringBatch application. But first, we need to understand that most of our SpringBatch applications are short-lived jobs. So short-lived jobs are designed to start quickly, execute a specific task or job, and then shut down. They are ephemeral. So most of the case, they are triggered by a scheduler or even an event. So in order to exemplify more use cases where short-lived jobs, we can, for example, think about our automated CI process triggered by a commit or pull request. Or even, for example, AWS Lambda, when we talk about cloud serverless function invocation. Okay? And in terms of SpringBatch, yes, SpringBatch can be a short-lived job. A cron job, for example, ETL jobs, import, export, cleanup task, and so on. So when we talk about SpringBatch in Kubernetes, most of the case we deploy them as a cron job or even a job. Now, in general, when we talk about Spring Boot applications, guys, remember we are not talking about only SpringBatch, but Spring Boot in this case in general. In order to monitor, most of the case we use Prometheus and Grafana. I'm not telling that this is the only way to go, but most of the case, right? Because we use, for example, Actuator, Micrometer, and Prometheus. And I think this is enough to start monitoring your Spring Boot application. And I'm telling you that this is Spring Boot application because we are referring on long-lived applications. So long-lived applications, for example, microservices, are services that start and run continuously. So we have here the difference between, for example, a SpringBatch, which is a short-lived application or job, against long-lived applications, which we can consider, for example, as microservice that start and run continuously, where, for example, short-lived applications start, do the job, and finish. So let's try to understand how we do that for long-lived applications first. So for long-lived applications, first, for example, we have here our microservice, and this microservice will use dependencies such as Actuator and Micrometer, for example. So doing that, we can enable and expose the Actuator endpoint for Prometheus. And then we will have the Prometheus, which will pull, okay? So the Prometheus use a pull model. So it scrapes the metrics from target, for example, here, the endpoint, which is our target source, at regular intervals. So Prometheus will start pulling the metrics from our application. And then we will have Grafana, which will use Prometheus as data source. So it will query Prometheus in order to get the metrics, and then we can create our dashboard for visualization. So this is not the only way to go. For example, for more complex or robust solutions, we can use, for example, the open telemetry. So this is something that you should investigate. I think that you already know about the open telemetry. But for example, we can go also for an enterprise solution, for example, using Sentry, Dynatrace, or even Datadog. So these are some enterprise solutions that you can explore later. I think that you guys already know. Now let's go back here. Now, thinking about this approach, okay, this approach works well only for long-lived applications where, for example, this endpoint, okay, is always up. So this will allow the Prometheus to continuously pulling the metrics from our application. So if we try to use the same approach for short-lived jobs or short-lived applications, this will not work because of the fact that Prometheus may try to get the metrics or pull the metric from our application, but as it is a short-lived application, maybe that time the endpoint will be not available. So as a result, metric from our job will be lost because Prometheus cannot reach the endpoint. So this is a big problem. We will not be able to monitor our SpringBatch or short-lived applications using this approach. So how can we solve it? How can we monitor short-lived jobs? So this is where we need to introduce you the push gateway. So Pushgateway acts as intermediate metrics store. So how does it work? For example, we have here our short-lived job, which is a SpringBatch application. The short-lived itself push the metrics to Pushgateway before exiting. So now the Pushgateway will contain the metrics. Then we can use Prometheus. The Prometheus can pull the metrics from the Pushgateway. Now we can use Grafana in order to use, for example, Prometheus as data source and create our dashboard. So we will use the Pushgateway in order to have the metrics, and then we will use Prometheus that scrapes the metrics from the Pushgateway. I know that we are talking too much, guys, but we need to understand these concepts, okay? Short-lived jobs and long-lived applications, and then the way that we are going to monitor, for example, the short-lived jobs, in our case, SpringBatch. So we are going to use the last video example. We are going to use the last short-lived application, which is our last SpringBatch application that we create in our last video, and then we are going to use the Pushgateway, the Prometheus, Grafana in order to create the dashboard to visualize the metrics. Okay, now what we need a SpringBatch application that you can find in our last video, and I will share with you guys. We are going to use Docker, and Docker we are going to provide the Pushgateway container, the Prometheus and Grafana. So now let's go, guys. So now, in order to start implementing the use case related to monitoring, as we can see here, you need first to get the Git repository, which you can find on our last video, which is the SpringBatch with AWS S3, multi-part download with AWS S3, and then you will find here on the description of this video the link to our GitHub repository. So once you are in GitHub, okay, you can just clone the application or clone the source code, and then we can start, for example, implementing here our use case related to monitoring and metrics. Now, this is the application that we have, okay? So assume that you are using the correct Git branch. For this particular use case, I'm starting using the dev branch, okay? So this is all that we need. And now let's start implementing the monitoring part. So as I was explaining you guys, the first thing that we need is Docker, right? Let's assume that you have Docker on your machine in order to get the containers for Pushgateway, Prometheus, and Grafana. So this is what we are going to do now. Let's create here a new branch and let's call it by monitoring. So now that we are on the new branch, which is the monitoring branch, this is the place that I think we can, for example, let's just replace this Docker Compose. So let's paste here the new one. Okay, so the only difference that we can see here is the fact that we have, for example, let me just see. So yeah, that's okay. So we have here the Postgres, because our SpringBatch application needs the Postgres in order to use it as data source for the job repository, right? Because we are not using resourceless job repository, and it use also min.io. That's the reason I'm telling you guys that you must go first to our previous video where we built this application. So this application is just downloading a file from AWS S3 bucket, okay, and then process it and save the records to database. So now, in order to connect to AWS S3, we will need also the min.io image or container in this case, and then of course for monitoring we will need I think Zipkin is not necessary for now, but we will need the Prometheus, the Pushgateway, and Grafana. So remember, you need to have your Prometheus. Sorry for showing you guys this, I know that this is just an example, but you will need to have the Prometheus YAML on your machine. So you need to actually change it, the location, in order to follow this tutorial. So we are going to create, I will just share with you guys here, the Prometheus YAML. So let's just put it here. So this is the Prometheus YAML. So here we have the scrape configs. Okay, you can just read a little bit more about the Prometheus configuration, but actually here we are just telling the Prometheus the target, so where it's gonna scrape, okay, the metrics. So this is the push gateway. As we can see here, we have the push gateway running on our port, which is 9091. And as you can see here, okay, we are just indicating. And here, the name of the job, you can put whatever you want. But for example, for our use case, let's just put here as SpringBatch, just like that. SpringBatch job, maybe SpringBatch job, just like that. Remember, you should point to the correct Prometheus YAML. And then we have here the Grafana, right? Grafana is the one that will allow us to visualize our dashboard. So then we need to understand, right? We have the Grafana, we have Prometheus, we have the push gateway, we have Prometheus, and then we have what we had on our last video, which is min.io and Postgres. So now the next thing that we need to do, we just need to run our Docker compose file in order to have our containers. So in that order, let's just call the Docker compose. Let's choose the file. In our case, we have only one file, but it doesn't matter. And let's run. So now we will have, let's go here. So we will have the Grafana Postgres, which our SpringBatch application is using, the min.io in order to have the bucket, right? In order to have the access to the bucket, which we are going to download the file. Then we will have the Prometheus and push gateway. So this one here is not necessary for now. So just ignore the zip key. Now, going back to our application, and the first thing that we need to do, let's check on our browser. Remember, this is what we will do. So for now, the first thing that we can do is let's check, for example, if we have already let me say, for example, the push gateway. So let's check the push gateway. Okay, so the push gateway is running, as we can see here. And also, for example, we can just go and let's check also the Prometheus. Okay, so Prometheus also is running. Amazing. We will understand all of them. And later we will see the Grafana. But for now, as we can try, for example, here, the Grafana. So we have here the Grafana. Yes, it will require the new password. So just like this. So admin. All right. Now we have also the Grafana. That's amazing, guys. Now we have the push gateway, Prometheus, Grafana, and we have also our application. But before that, in order to move further, we will need also to access the min.io. So this is the min.io, where we can get the credentials of the min.io. Is very simple. So we put it here. Okay. So the username is admin and the password is this one here. So let's just call it admin and then admin hash, just like that. So here on min.io, we can see that we have some files. This is very simple. We have here some files that we are going to use in order to monitor our application. So now that we have our containers running, the next thing that we need to do is, for example, start adding some dependencies that will make our short-lived application or our short-lived job, right? This is a SpringBatch application. So these dependencies will allow our SpringBatch application to communicate with the push gateway, because as we can see here, this is what we have. Our short-lived application should push metrics to Pushgateway. That's what we are going to do. So in order to do that, first we need to understand that we need to add here some dependencies. So where we get the dependencies, for example, for the particular application, the first dependency that we need is actuator. So let's just call here the Maven dependency for actuator. Okay, not milestone, but the latest dependency. Let's go back to our application. Let's add here the actuator. I think we don't need to specify here the version because it will just get from the parent. The next dependency that we need is the Micrometer registry Prometheus. So this is the one that we are going to have, the Micrometer register Prometheus. Let's go back here. Let's paste. So the next one will be the Pushgateway. So these are the dependencies that we need in order to make our application, okay, to communicate with Prometheus and the Pushgateway itself. So the other dependency that we need is Micronaut, Micrometer registry Prometheus Pushgateway. So having that, now we can start, for example, testing if our, let's go back to our browser. So let's take a look here. So we have here the Pushgateway working, right? So now, first thing that we need to do, let's test our application in order to see if it's working as we expect. But before that, we need to go to our min.io and let's check here. We have files to process. And if you understand this application, we'll just go and download, okay, file from the bucket using, for example, this S3 client that we have created in our previous video, and we'll filter the file that starts with 2025. So in that order, it will just get this file here. And it's a very small file. So now let's run our application. Let's check if everything is okay. Okay, as we can see, the application downloaded the file, okay, and so on. So that's something that we saw on our previous video. So this is the file that it has processed. Now, let's go to Prometheus Pushgateway because our short-lived application should push metrics to Pushgateway. Now, let's refresh. Okay, we don't have anything. So now, the first thing that we need to do is to add some properties on our application property in order to make the Pushgateway to start pushing the metrics. So now, the first thing that we need to do is we are going to application property and we are going to add some new properties that will allow our application to push the metrics to Pushgateway. But remember, we are using actuators. So the actuators is the first step that we need to understand when we are talking about, for example, metrics or observability. So we know that there are traces, metrics, and logs. But for now, the first thing that we are going to do, we are going to use the management, okay? So we are activating the actuator. So we are going to use the endpoints, and we are going to use the web that expose, okay? Instead of exclude, we are going to do include Prometheus, just like that, okay? So here we are start adding or enabling some actuator features. Now the next thing, we should enable the metrics export for Prometheus. So in that order, let's use management that Prometheus. Then we need to specify that we are talking about metrics, and let's say, for example, export that enable true, okay? So as we can see, this flag, I think we don't need because by default, as we can see here, for example, if I just put it here, when I was typing here, we can see that the enable true is the default behavior. So maybe you don't need to add it, okay? But just in terms of making, so as I want to make this video to be more clear and specific about this property, okay, we need to just put it enable. But remember, the default value is true. Now, the next thing that we need to do is to enable also the push gateway. So in that order, let me just, for example, copy until here. And then let's put it here, export, for example, then we specify the push gateway. And as you can see, the push gateway, the default property, the default value is false. So this is, as you can see here, the default is false, and now we need to activate. Okay, and I think you don't need to do that, okay, because it will just use the default, let's say default host, okay, but and as you can see is 9091, the default host, which is localhost 9091. And if we can see here, we are exposing it, my bad, so if we take here and push gateway, we are exposing it on the port 9091, and we can even confirm it here. Okay, so that's the reason I am just thinking, okay, should we talk about the port? Yes, of course, because maybe when you are going to production, or maybe when you start, for example, creating your own libraries or starters, you will need to specify the correct port, right, or the host. Now, so that's the reason we are going to put, for example, here, and then we can, for example, specify that we are going to use the push gateway. Okay, and we can say, okay, so the push gateway, for example, we can use the address, right, or even the schema and so on. So let's just put here the address, okay, as localhost 9091. The first thing that we can do, as we can see, we can start, for example, adding some more properties. For example, the push rate. The push rate is very important. Why? Because we need to understand, okay, the rate that we are going to, for example, push it. So for example, here is 1 minute, okay, which is default, but we can put it for example 1 millisecond. I don't know, you can just play with this property here. And now the last property that we are going to use is the push gateway, okay, and we can say, for example, the job. So here we are going to specify the name of our job. But for this particular use case, let's just use the name of our job will be this one, because, for example, you can have some different jobs, right? For example, you have your SpringBatch application or SpringBatch job or short-lived application that will, for example, import customers. Then you have another one that will import payments, or the other one that will export, for example, all the decision of your, let's say, business rules and so on, right? So that's the reason that you can, for example, here specify the name. The name here can be anything, but for us, let's just use here the application name, right? So let's just call it spring.application name. So this will be the name of our push gateway job. Okay, the next thing that we need to do, yes, I think for this particular video, we are using the dark theme. Yeah, for now it's okay. Now let's try to run once again our application in order to see, for example, as we can see here on our let's say on our push gateway. So let me just minimize it. So when we go here on our push gateway, we don't have anything. But now let's run our application, because now we have here the configurations for actuator and so on. Okay. Okay. Let's see, we have here a warning. That's amazing. So Prometheus Matter Registry. It's telling us something. It means that it's working already. So now let's go to our push gateway and let's refresh it. Okay. Okay, now we have, as we can see, we have a job which the name is multi-part download. If we go back here on our application, we will see that we specified, right, management Prometheus matrix export push gateway job is equal application name. What's the application name? The application name is multi-part download. So the job, okay, is this one here, multi-part download. Now let's start exploring. So now let's try to understand. We have here so many things, guys. Wow, we have here some different things. And that's amazing because this is what we exactly want. So we have some kind of metrics. For example, we have here the gauge, we have a summary, we have a counter, and now let's try to understand what each of them are. But before that, let's try to find, for example, something like, for example, a Spring and anything that contains batch. Okay, and the first thing that we can, for example, start looking here on Prometheus. So guys, remember our application, sorry, not this one here, I don't think, what is it? So our short-lived application, our SpringBatch job is just sent, okay, just pushed the metrics to the push gateway. That's the reason that we can see them here. So here we have some methods, and you say, okay, how does it work? So if we go, for example, here on, SpringBatch documentation, okay, we will see, for example, when we talk about the monitoring and metrics, this section describes which metrics are provided out of the box. Okay, so SpringBatch out of the box will provide these metrics here. Okay, so that's the reason when we, for example, add the dependencies, okay, we are able to see them here on the push gateway. So we can, for example, disable that and so on. That's something that we are going to see. But now let's go, for example, let's try to see it in practice. So what we have here, for example, we can find, for example, SpringBatch. Let's see how we can, for example, find the exit status of our job. So for example, we can just go here, job, for example, and we can specify here seconds. Okay, and I think we can just go here and we will see, okay, we have here some labels. Okay, so this is the summary. Okay, and we can see, so the job name is multi-part download. Okay, and we can see here the SpringBatch job name itself. So this is the push gateway job name, which we have here, right? So this one here, which corresponds to the application name. And then we can see that we have also the SpringBatch job name. So this is the job that we have on our SpringBatch itself. So if we take a look here, the name of our job, as we can see here, is sync sales job. So that's it that we can see here, sync sales job. For example, if we say, for example, here a different name, let's say, for example, import customers, something like that. And if we run the application, we will see that in push gateway, okay, we will see the job name will be import customers. So now let's go back here. Let me refresh. Okay, now if we find once again the same thing, okay, we can see here import customers, and we can see also the exit status of our batch. Guys, that's the first part. We can see now the metrics are coming to the push gateway. We have them here. Now let's go back. So now let's go back to our push gateway and let's try to understand what we have here. Guys, here you will have everything that you need to understand. Okay, so you will have some metrics related to, for example, the system load, average, and so on. Guys, you will need to explore it later. Okay, for example, the garbage collector, the memory it used, and so on. So guys, we have information that we can build a very nice dashboard in order to visualize the behavior of our application in terms of infrastructure, the consumption, the memory footprint, and so on. Okay, so guys, now let's go back to SpringBatch metrics. So now what we are going to do, so now we understand that we have here some metrics. Okay, we will explore them, guys. We will explore them. The next thing that we need to do is just to check if Prometheus is pulling, okay, these metrics from the push gateway, okay, to itself. So in that order, we can, for example, just do something very simple, which is, for example, here we are checking this one here, right? So this one here, we can just use the same one. So SpringBatch job seconds. So in that order, we can do something very simple. Now let's go to Prometheus. So here in Prometheus, I think the first thing that we need to add is to, for example, we need to enable the query tree view. The first thing that we can do is, for example, we're just going to use SpringBatch. For example, as we can see, we have some counters. Now, let's use SpringBatch, for example, SpringBatch. And what we can check first, we can check, for example, seconds. Okay, we can use count. So this one here, let's check, let's run the query. Okay, yes, now we can see, okay, oops, my bad. We can see that we can see them, okay, in Prometheus. So we can see here, error none, the job name, okay, the Prometheus job is this one here. And we can have also the SpringBatch job name, which is the import customers. And we can have also the job exits status. So this is amazing, guys. Why? Because having all these properties here, now we can go to Grafana, which is running already, and start, for example, using Grafana in order to visualize each SpringBatch job status in Grafana, instead of, for example, going to your database, because SpringBatch uses the job repository, right, that you can find that. So instead of going there in database and query for the exit status of your job, or even going here in Prometheus, which is not practical, we will build now the dashboard. Okay, but before that, let's explore a little bit more. For example, we can use something, for example, just to query, for example, the job exit status itself. So this is the Prometheus query language. Okay, this is very simple, guys. This is very simple. We can just use, for example, just like this, right? So we are specifying that we are querying, for example, the exit status that is equal, for example, complete. Okay, so here the Prometheus will only have all jobs exit status that are completed. Okay, and then we can see also the graph here. Now, the next thing that we need to do, we need to build, right, our dashboard. But let me go and explore a little bit more. For example, we can see as our SpringBatch application, for example, is, let's see here, okay, it just first downloads, right, it downloads the file, and then it's going to read, okay, from a file, and then it will write to database. So we can check, for example, how many lines we read, how many lines we have written, and how many, for example, lines we processed, and everything we will visualize on a Grafana dashboard. So in order to do that, of course, first you need to understand, right, which metrics we have here in, let's say, in Prometheus, right? For example, we can, I think we can just use this SpringBatch item read seconds count. So we can see here the read, let's see, it's one. Okay, so maybe let's read this file that contains 3000 lines, I think. So in that order, let me just go back here on our application, and here the place that we are filtering the file. Okay, let's put here the 2024, because this file here starts with 2024. And now let's run our application once again. Okay, so the application finished. Okay, so as we can see here, we have everything is okay. The application, guys, that's the main point here. As you can see, our application starts and finish. Okay, it will not be, for example, running forever. Okay, so it will start, it will do its job, okay, then it shut down. So this is the concept called by short-lived jobs or short-lived application. But now let's go back here. Now this is the place that we can see how many lines we have read. Okay, now as you can see, guys, now here we have 3000, wow, 3,340 lines that we read. Guys, that's amazing. And if we can, for example, or put here stacked or even unstacked. So here we can see, so the first job we read only one line, I think, And this one here, we read, for example, more lines, which is 3000 and something. Now, we can, for example, explore a little bit more. For example, that's the reason I'm telling you guys. For example, we can put here using Prometheus query language, which is very simple. So first we need to understand here, right, the matter or something like that. And then we need to understand the label. Okay, so for example, here, SpringBatch reads, count. Okay, let me just first refresh it. Okay, and now let's go back here on Prometheus Pushgateway. Okay, we can see here the item reading duration and so on. Okay, so for example, here we can see, right, 3240. This is the number of lines that we have read. And if we go here, it's the same, right? It's the same. So now, for example, we can upload a different file. Yes, we can upload a different file, for example, that contains, let me see if I have here, 1116 lines. Okay, so for example, we will now check, for example, this file here. Okay, so we have read this one and this one. Now, let me first, for example, delete. I think first I have to download. I don't know if I have it. Let me delete this one. Now let's run once again our application, and it should read 1116 lines. So in that order, let's run once again. Guys, that's not bullshit. That's what I want you guys to understand. Okay, so here the job start, have done its job, and now shut down. Now if you go back here on Pushgateway, let's refresh. Okay, let's refresh. Let's find here, for example, SpringBatch item reader second. Here we have, okay, and it even tell us, for example, the job name, okay, and also the step name, guys. The step that contains, so the step item reader, which is from file downloaded to DB. Where we have this, guys, that's amazing. So let's go back here where we have that information. So if we check here on our SpringBatch job on the application code, we will see the step here. So we have the first step, which is the download file, and the next step is from file downloaded to DB. And this is the information that we have here. So SpringBatch item read step name. So this is the step name that we have here. As you can see, this is a step. Okay, and if we go back here, this is the step. So we will have all the information. So we have here the amount of the lines, the amount of lines that we have read. Okay, and we can of course go back here on Prometheus, for example. Okay, because first is our application. Guys, I will repeat always. Our application sent to the Pushgateway, and we check here on the Pushgateway, voila, it's working. And then we need to check here on Prometheus. Now, if we go here on Prometheus, as we can see, the last time that we checked, okay, it was 3240. Now, if we once again, okay, now we read only 1116. Guys, this is the metrics, and we will play with them, okay? And of course, you could put it like that and so on. And for example, if you change the name of your job or the application name, it will change also the color of here. Now, guys, that's enough. You will explore a little bit more, for example, about the Prometheus. For example, you could just look for a name, you can filter, you can do some other stuff, okay? You can even use, for example, not the explain, but you can, for example, use the documentation, right? The official documentation in order to learn a little bit more about the Prometheus. Okay, so this is the official documentation, and you will understand that it's a very simple concept. Now, guys, let's move, and of course we could explore a little bit more, some like how many lines, for example, we have written, processed, skipped, and so on. Okay, but it will make our video to become very long. Okay, now the next thing that we need to do is to explore Grafana. So before moving to Grafana, I really want to show you the last thing. Okay, guys, so let's go back to our application. Okay, Now we are going to change, for example, the name of our application itself. So for example, here, let's just use export. So let's just call the name of our application will be export sales. And here also, for example, instead of import customers, let's use the same name. So what we are doing here, so changing the name of our application will change also the name of our push gateway job. So for now, let's go here on our application. Let's upload a file that contains, for example, 3000. Now that we have here the file, let's run our application first. Okay, the application complete. Now let's just check here on push gateway, refresh this. Okay, so we have here export sales. So this is what we have when we change, for example, here the name, okay, of our, let's say, push gateway job. So for this particular use case, we are just using the Spring application name, of course. Now, for example, if we change once again, for example, let's just call it by download documents. So now download documents, and of course we can also, for example, change here, right, the SpringBatch job name. And of course, guys, just remember here we are changing, right? So here, when we change here, we are changing the name of our push gateway job in terms of infrastructure of push gateway. And then we change here also the name. We are just changing the name of our SpringBatch. Now let's run our application, but for this particular case, let's upload a different file. Okay, instead of this one that contains 3000, we are going to use another one that contains, for example, 1000 and something. So here we have the file, right, that contains 1116. And now let's run the application. Okay, now the last one, okay, we are going to change, for example, here. Let's use another name here for our job. Let's call it by export taxpayers. Yeah, just something like that. So let me just copy the same name here, and let's also change it here. Instead of download document, we are going to have it as export taxpayers. So for this particular one, which is export taxpayers, we want to upload a file that will fail the job, okay, just to make it better. Now let's just delete this one here, and now let's upload a new file. So as we can see, this file, when we run the application, it will fail. Will fail just because I have add here, for example, I just put some bad lines, okay, so SpringBatch will fail. I will show you guys what I mean by that. Okay, so the application failed. Okay, if we go here, we have the exit status failed. Now, what we have here, so if we go to our push gateway, okay, let me just refresh it, we will see the 3 jobs that we have. Okay, of course, this is not what you should do, okay, but I'm just trying to show you guys what happened, for example, if you have some different push gateways jobs, because sometimes you will need, okay, most of the case you will need. And now, for example, then the last one, okay, that we run, if we, for example, find here batch, okay, and for example, if we just find here any metrics related to the job itself, for example, here we will see that the exit status, okay, is failed. So here we can see that we are using the job export taxpayers. Okay, so this one here. And now if we, for example, minimize this and open this one here, export sales, which we also run, and we look, for example, the job itself, we will see, okay, that this is another job, export sales. Okay, so we will see that the job exit status is complete. So we will have all different kind of jobs, okay, with their own metrics. Now this is time that we can go, for example, to Prometheus. The last time, for example, we can use SpringBatch, for example. So let's use the count. Okay, so we can see, okay, we have 3 different jobs here, and of course we can even use, for example, here the, let's say, the graph, which is better. Okay, so for example, let me put it all. Okay, so we can just select one, okay, or another. So here we can use here like that, for example. And now let me, for example, show you guys how, for example, you can just query, for example, a job that the exit status is equal, for example, complete. So let's go here in table of table. For example, for this particular job here, we will see. So SpringBatch, let's use here the counter. Yeah, so here we can see, okay, the exit status. Of course, we could use the graph, which is much better. And here, using the Prometheus query language, we can, for example, check only the job that the status, for example, is equal, for example, complete, right? So we can just use here. You will see that all the jobs that failed, okay, we will not see them here, okay? So as we can see, we are just querying the job, okay, SpringBatch job status, which is equal complete, okay? And of course, we could do also, for example, failed, just like that, and we can see them here. So this is Prometheus query language. That's why I'm running here the query. So you have to explore a little bit more about that, guys. And of course, we could see anything that we want. Okay, for example, here we can, instead of doing that, so we could also query. So for example, how many lines we read for each, right? For each, let's say, batch, okay? As we can see here, for each our SpringBatch job itself. But, and you of course could also, for example, query, for example, only the applications that, or SpringBatch jobs that have read, for example, more than some amount of data, okay? And of course, not only read, for example, we can also do the process, okay? Which is the item processor, okay? As we can see here. So the one that failed didn't process anything, okay? So for example, read, right? If we put here the read count, we will see that this one that I think, okay, this one that failed, let me check here the status. So this is the status of export sales, okay? It just showing us succeed. Maybe this is another one, but of course we could check, for example, process, and also, for example, write, okay? So for example, the chunk, right? The chunk write counter. So count, okay, we will see how many time, okay, we written using the chunk oriented processing, guys. So why I'm showing you guys this, okay, this is because we are going to use, for example, this kind of query in Grafana. So Grafana will use Prometheus as data source. The way that we are going to use Grafana and Prometheus will be mostly using the Prometheus query language. So that's the reason I'm showing you guys, and you should play a little bit more, okay, with this kind of, let's say, Prometheus query language. Okay, so just explore, just go here, documentation, okay, and start understanding how to query. Okay, so you have here the basic query, expressions, functions, and so on. Okay, so that's very simple, guys. Now let's go to Grafana. But before that, guys, we are going to build our dashboard. Very nice way to monitor your application. So don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and if you can, please leave any comment, positive thing or anything that you have liked, but this will motivate me to make more videos, guys. Please support the channel, and see you in the next video, which will be Grafana dashboard. Now let's go.